In 2025, neuroscience is sounding an early warning. Using AI tools like ChatGPT may come with measurable cognitive costs. One widely discussed preprint from MIT's Media Lab reported about a 47% reduction in brain activity when participants wrote essays with AI assistance compared to doing it on their own. The sample was small, and the study hasn't completed peer review, but paired with surveys and follow-up research, experts caution that the pattern points to real risks of cognitive offloading. The heart of the issue is that our brains are wired to conserve effort. That shortcut once helped us survive, but today it may be undermining how we think. And now the question is, what happens when the numbers reveal just how steep the collapse can be? The critical thinking collapse. What researchers labeled the critical thinking collapse didn't come from a single number. In the MIT Media Lab preprint that drew so much attention in 2025, they reported 3 striking findings. First, during writing tasks, participants who used large language models showed about 47% lower EEG activity and connectivity compared to those who wrote unaided, a sign that core decision-making networks were far less engaged. Second, although their output looked polished, LLM users wrote roughly 60% faster, while also demonstrating a 32% drop in what researchers called relevant cognitive load. In plain terms, their brains were doing less of the heavy lifting normally required for reasoning and problem-solving. And perhaps most worrying, follow-up tests revealed that about 83% of participants couldn't accurately recall or even quote the text they had just produced with AI help. Those numbers are jarring, but they need careful interpretation. The study was a preprint, not yet peer-reviewed, with a relatively small sample size of 54 participants across its initial sessions. Later rounds had even fewer, so it can't provide final proof. The trends are strong enough to raise alarms, but the researchers themselves emphasize that longer-term and larger studies are essential before drawing hard conclusions. Still, even preliminary signals matter when they point to the possibility that outsourcing too much mental labor dulls engagement across multiple dimensions. Speed without retention, production without depth, and polish without practice. To understand why this collapse feels so consequential, consider how working unaided engages the brain. When you wrestle with even a simple task, say calculating numbers on paper, your brain activates circuits for working memory, attention, and error correction. That struggle is not wasted effort. It is the sequence that creates skill. Shift the task to AI, and you see the answer instantly without activating those circuits. The result may look correct, but your mind has skipped the very steps that strengthen it. It's not unlike choosing to ride a drone across a field instead of walking it yourself. You reach the other side, but your legs, balance, and stamina never get tested. This shortcutting is where the idea of cognitive debt makes sense. Just as financial debt lets you enjoy something now, but forces repayment later, cognitive debt trades away training today for weakness tomorrow. A single request to an AI won't erase your abilities, but repeated substitution builds up the cost. Over weeks and months, what once felt natural, recalling details, tracking logic, building an argument, can start to feel harder, slower, even hazy. It's not that the skills disappear overnight, but they gradually lose fluency, much like muscles atrophying after too much inactivity. That pattern also showed in the neural recordings from the 2025 trials. When participants solved logic problems independently, their EEG patterns reflected high-frequency activity associated with alertness. When they leaned on AI assistance, though, many traces shifted toward the slower rhythms usually seen during drowsiness or light sleep. Outwardly, they appeared engaged, upright posture, eyes fixed, fingers on the keyboard. But inside, their neural activity suggested drift, as if the brain was sliding into standby mode. Some argued that saving energy is no bad thing. Why not let the brain rest while the machine works? The flaw in that reasoning lies in how neurons adapt. Connections between them follow a use it or lose it principle. Without continued rehearsal of reasoning steps, brain networks don't simply stay idle, they weaken. Over time, the forest paths of cognition grow over and fade. The effects rarely announce themselves with one dramatic failure. Instead, you sense a slow rising fog. Hesitation on problems you once mastered, impatience during challenges, difficulty recalling details that once came easily. That's the hidden interest you pay on cognitive debt. Math offered a clear illustration in the trials. Writing equations, holding interim sums, and correcting small errors build not just arithmetic skill, but general habits of sequencing and error detection. These transfer into broader decision-making. By contrast, handing over every step to an AI produced answers that looked efficient, but left no lasting footprint in memory or skill. The researchers stressed this point again and again. The issue is not speed. Fast work, while actively engaged, can still be rich training. Bypassing practice entirely erases the gains that practice would have delivered. And it wasn't only math or logic that suffered. The same study tracked participants constructing written arguments. Those who received AI polishing performed well initially, but when tested without assistance afterward, they stumbled more than peers who had done all of the writing themselves. Neural scans supported the findings. Even when their essays gleamed with AI aid, the cortical firing behind them was predictably weaker. A surface gloss disguised an interior collapse. Another sobering detail was how universal the effect seemed. In early reports, the drop was not restricted to young students or tech enthusiasts. Middle-aged workers, older adults, and even participants who described themselves as skeptical of AI all showed similar reductions when they relied on LLMs. The brain adjusts to habit, not to personal intention. Whether cautious or overconfident, those who substituted repeated steps with machine output experienced less activity and weaker recall. That's why neuroscientists kept returning to the image of blackouts. The scans showed robust, city-like patterns of activity during natural, unaided problem-solving. Then, as AI filled in answers, entire regions dimmed in unison, like sections of a city losing power block by block. What worried them was not a minor flicker, but the possibility of repeated outages becoming the brain's new baseline. This explains why the phrase critical thinking collapse hit a nerve. The evidence doesn't suggest a tiny trimming of effort. It describes a deep silence settling over cognitive functions central to reasoning and memory. LLMs can deliver impressive shortcuts, but they seem to lull the very networks we depend on to remain sharp. Even unfinished as the study was, it points toward a broader truth. The shallow ease of AI use doesn't just replace effort in the moment. It might also dull the mind's readiness across time. And yet, there's an important nuance that often gets lost. The collapse is not inevitable. The same researchers hinted that when AI is used in a more interactive way, questioning it, challenging its output, treating it as a sparring partner rather than a substitute, the brain may keep many of its circuits active. That potential deserves its own discussion, and we'll return to that later. For now, remember this detail. The problem isn't the existence of AI, it's how we let it replace processes that our brains need to practice. Recognizing the cost of foregoing effort brings us to a deeper layer of the story. The tendency to reach for easier routes when harder ones build strength isn't new at all. It is part of something far more ancient, written into how the brain evolved to save calories and effort. That instinct once protected us, but in a world filled with constant shortcuts, it takes on a very different role. Addicted to easy. Addicted to easy is not a metaphor. It's the everyday reality of how modern brains interact with technology. The wiring that once nudged humans toward conserving energy now collides with machines designed to give us effortless answers. What began as survival instinct transforms into a bias for convenience, and in today's environment, that bias is no longer neutral. It pulls us toward behaviors that steadily replace active thought with passive consumption. Instead of a single clear choice between danger and safety, we now live surrounded by frictionless options. Type a question and receive a full solution. Skim a pre-written outline rather than wrestle with a blank page. Navigate instantly without recalling routes or learning maps. Each of these instances feels trivial, yet every time, the brain sidesteps the chance to practice. The habit of skipping effort, once rare, becomes constant. The danger is not just that people prefer shortcuts. The deeper issue lies in how repetition rewires reward systems. Each time you let AI shoulder the work, your brain releases a little spark of relief. What might have taken focus and strain now feels resolved in seconds. That soothing effect repeats often enough, and the cycle becomes automatic. Confronted with effort, your mind learns to recoil. Offered a shortcut, it learns to prefer it. Over time, working through a challenge unaided feels progressively more uncomfortable. Imagine the difference between fast food and a home-cooked meal. The quick option fills you, but the body gains little strength from it. In the same way, information provided instantly by AI satisfies an immediate task, but it never trains your cognitive processes. Day after day, you may feel productive, but beneath the surface, your capacity to think deeply erodes. The calories are there, but not the nourishment. Psychology has long recognized this pattern. Researchers call it the path of least resistance. Humans will reliably choose an easier route, especially when effort and reward are disconnected in time. The critical cost shows up in motivation. Once accustomed to quick relief, people find heavier effort increasingly daunting. Returning to unaided reasoning feels like running uphill after months of sitting still. That struggle isn't laziness in the casual sense. It is laziness engineered through habit. Consider a student who once wrote essays alone. After months of AI assistance, the same blank page now triggers instant discomfort. Or a worker who once managed long reports suddenly feels blocked after a single opening line. The knowledge remains, but the tolerance for strain has disappeared. The brain has recalibrated to expect assistance, and its refusal to engage without it masquerades as disinterest. This is more than speculation. Human-computer interaction studies and surveys presented at CHI 2025 show consistent self-reports from knowledge workers. Many describe a noticeable decline in motivation to tackle tasks from beginning to end once they grow reliant on generative AI. They acknowledge that work feels easier, but also flatter. Microsoft's CHI survey reinforced this point with a sharper edge. The more confidence workers expressed in AI's abilities, the less critical reasoning they engaged in themselves. Rather than correcting or questioning, high-confidence users tended to accept, skim, and move on. The conclusion was sobering. Trust in AI can hollow out cognitive effort rather than enhance it. The invisibility of this shift is what makes it dangerous. Nobody feels their prefrontal cortex going quiet while they type prompts. Nobody sees a warning bar when their hippocampus sits idle. They only notice relief. A finished draft, a solved puzzle, a filled page. The subtle loss of endurance remains in the background until a task demands genuine labor. By then, the gap yawns clear. It's not a collapse that announces itself in one day, but an accumulation disguised as progress. If you want a direct measure of your own susceptibility, ask yourself, when was the last time you solved something start to finish without help? A math problem, a written draft, a route on foot, memory recalled instead of searched? If answering that question feels difficult, it signals how quickly this cycle embeds itself. The very discomfort you feel resisting shortcuts is proof your brain has adjusted to easier defaults. Compounding this inner drive are cultural signals that treat convenience as unquestionable good. Schools advertise apps that remove tedious steps. Workplaces encourage employees to streamline with prompts. Ads for consumer software praise instant, frictionless results. The outer environment reinforces the inner bias, as if every signpost urges less effort. When brain wiring already pushes in that direction, resistance weakens further. The shortcut path doesn't just exist. It is celebrated, lit brightly, and rewarded. Seen across a wider lens, AI's influence fits into a broader pattern of technological ease. GPS shaved away the need to recall routes. Streaming services removed choice by autoplaying content. Grammar tools reshaped sentences in real time. Each transition appeared harmless, but together, they conditioned people to surrender mental responsibility step by step. Generative AI represents the most powerful escalation yet, because it doesn't remove just one micro-decision. It can replace an entire sequence of thinking. Some may cling to the reassurance that awareness alone protects them. Surveys tell a different story. Workers often admitted they knew these tools made them less engaged, less willing to grapple directly, but chose them anyway. This reveals the depth of the pattern. Knowledge of the risk doesn't dissolve the appeal, because the brain's chemistry favors the immediate slackening of effort. The cycle, once embedded, doesn't stop without deliberate intervention. Breaking it requires a conscious push, like retraining atrophied muscles. The discomfort of thinking through what could be automated feels jarring precisely because the neural circuits no longer expect it. Yet building back resilience cannot happen without such stress. Each resisted shortcut is not wasted time. It reactivates the same networks that bear the load of reasoning. Without that strain, competence drains quietly away, leaving hollow efficiency in its place. This is why Addicted to Easy is not a moral failing, but a predictable clash between old biology and abundant modern shortcuts. The instinct for conservation keeps firing, only now paired with a technological environment that feeds it endlessly. People interpret this as laziness or distraction, but at its root, it is conditioning that can spread across entire populations of workers, students, and professionals who never intended to weaken themselves. And yet, the story does not end with awareness of behavior. Beneath the habit loops and self-reports, the scans from 2025 offered even sharper proof. When researchers looked directly at the brains of habitual AI users, they didn't just see vague mentions of inattention or drift. They saw specific regions dimming, core areas tied to memory, decision-making, and control. The next stage of the evidence is not about surveys or everyday habits. It is about literal structures in the brain switching off, piece by piece. The brain regions shutting down. When scientists examined brain imaging from the 2025 trials, the patterns were stark. The decline was not just about people feeling less focused or slowing down. The scans revealed that 3 core regions, the prefrontal cortex, the hippocampus, and the anterior cingulate cortex, were consistently less active whenever participants leaned heavily on AI systems. Each one governs a key capability we rely on daily: reasoning, memory, and self-regulation. And each one showed measurable dips in activation under AI assistance, raising concerns that these fundamental capacities are left undertrained when we outsource thinking too often. The prefrontal cortex, located just behind the forehead, is often called the command center of the brain. It is the region you use to hold competing options in mind, plan steps, and rein in impulses before making a choice. Functional scans from the MIT Media Lab preprint, together with parallels from digital addiction research, showed reduced connectivity and weaker signals in this region when participants solved problems with LLM help. Instead of demonstrating the characteristic activity of careful planning, the prefrontal cortex dimmed, as if the heavy work had been passed over to the machine. Neuroscientists cautioned that this reduction, while not permanent proof of damage, indicates underuse. And like any system in the brain, circuits that fire less often gradually weaken in responsiveness. The hippocampus, buried deeper in the brain's medial temporal lobe, is critical for encoding experiences into lasting memory. Every time you work through a problem and commit the process to memory, the hippocampus is the reason the lesson sticks. In the 2025 experiments, participants who relied on AI prompts and generated text showed notably less hippocampal activation. Follow-up testing confirmed weaker recall days and weeks later, suggesting memories weren't consolidating properly. Researchers highlighted that this functional weakening didn't just reduce immediate retention. It meant participants missed the chance to build scaffolding for future learning. Without hippocampal reinforcement, knowledge never becomes durable. While there was no claim that AI use directly caused structural brain change, the persistent underactivation raised concern about long-term risks if this pattern is repeated constantly. The anterior cingulate cortex, a strip of tissue connecting cognitive and emotional systems, was also quieter in the scans. This region helps you spot errors, manage conflicts between choices, and regulate emotions during frustration. It is what lets you acknowledge difficulty and still keep trying. In the AI-assisted sessions, activation in the anterior cingulate dipped significantly. That finding implied that not only were participants outsourcing cognitive tasks, they were also dampening the neural signals that support persistence and frustration tolerance. Fewer signals here could make challenges feel disproportionately taxing, leading people to avoid them altogether. This wasn't about laziness. The data suggested a functional weakening of the very circuitry that makes grit possible. Each of these regions serves a role that viewers can easily grasp. The prefrontal cortex organizes decisions. The hippocampus encodes memory. The anterior cingulate manages conflict and error detection. When all 3 show reduced activation under the same conditions, the pattern is more than coincidence. It represents a synchronized retreat of systems needed for higher thinking. The integrated nature of the brain means these functions don't sit in isolation. Once one hub weakens, others are affected too. Reduced encoding hampers planning. Reduced error detection erodes memory consolidation. The system hollows out together. To help visualize this, neuroscientists likened the brain under heavy AI reliance to a city. Key institutions: the town hall of decision-making, the library of memory, the courthouse of regulation, fall dark one by one. Meanwhile, vending machines dispensing instant answers stay brightly lit. The city still appears alive on the surface, but its deeper infrastructure is quiet. It runs efficiently in the moment, yet loses the capacities that make long-term resilience possible. That single metaphor communicates a simple truth. Rapid convenience can come at the cost of critical civic structures inside the brain. The broader concern is what functional underactivation might mean long-term. MRI data showed some patterns in habitual AI users that echo those seen in clinical research on cognitive decline. Reduced hippocampal activity, weaker prefrontal engagement, and muted anterior cingulate signals overlap, at least functionally, with markers associated with higher dementia risk in other contexts. Crucially, the researchers emphasize this is not direct evidence that AI use causes dementia. These are cautionary echoes, not proofs of disease. To establish real causation would require decades of longitudinal data, but the resemblance alone raised alarms. If the same brain regions repeatedly register silence, they may gradually remodel in ways that resemble decline. Neuroplasticity strengthens what is used, and just as reliably weakens what is neglected. The unsettling part is that the brain provides no instant warning system for this silencing. People don't feel their prefrontal cortex disengaging when a machine drafts their outline. They don't notice hippocampal inactivity when solutions come prepackaged. They walk away with finished output that looks productive. Only later, when they try to recall details or solve something independently, do the gaps emerge. By then, the cycle of underuse has already repeated enough times to reinforce itself. What complicates matters further is the cultural environment. At the same time these findings emerged, workplaces, schools, and apps were formally encouraging reliance on AI tools to boost efficiency. That meant the very tendencies under scrutiny were not just habits, but institutional norms. If entire cohorts adapt their brains under such conditions, the worry expands beyond the individual. A society that fails to train its own decision-making, memory, and self-regulation networks risks a collective erosion of capacity. It may continue to produce outputs, reports, assignments, polished documents, but the deeper reserve of cognitive strength is left diminished. This realization unsettled scientists in 2025 because it shifted the conversation from immediate utility to long-term capacity. Temporary lapses can be reversed with rest, but when entire regions are left underactivated consistently, the risk becomes patterned atrophy. The brain, built to adapt, may recalibrate itself permanently to lower activity levels in areas fundamental to intelligence. Even if further research tempers these early worries, the principle stands. Unused circuits grow weaker. The data showed AI-assisted sessions repeatedly created the conditions for underuse. If these patterns hold, the next question is who faces the greatest risk. Adults with mature brains can experience functional weakening, but younger brains still building their networks may be shaped more fundamentally by these same habits. The transition from temporary functional tuning to permanent rewiring isn't uniform across ages. And that is why the discussions soon turned to the generations most immersed in AI from their earliest years. Gen Z and Gen Alpha at risk. It is one thing when adults with established neural scaffolding rely too much on artificial intelligence. The brain still bears a cost, but its core pathways for reasoning, memory, and self-regulation are already in place. The greater concern is with children and adolescents, where those same pathways are still under construction. For Gen Z and Gen Alpha, AI is stitched directly into the fabric of learning, communication, and self-expression from the start. It is not an add-on introduced later. It is the environment they grow within. That difference carries weight, because their brains are still wiring at maximum plasticity. Recent surveys drive this home. In 2025, an American study found that about a third of parents with children aged 0 to 8 reported that their kids had already used AI in some form for learning. In the UK, more than half of surveyed parents said they worried their children were becoming too dependent on AI for schoolwork. What was once a futuristic concern has settled into the daily lives of families worldwide. Even among very young learners, machine assistance is already normal. Parents described a mix of relief and unease. Relief because homework and projects suddenly became simpler to finish. Unease because they feared the work was no longer strengthening the skills it was meant to train. This brings us to a critical fact about development. Plasticity peaks in youth. Children's brains are far more flexible than adults. A child can absorb new language or master an instrument with relative ease because their circuits are wide open for growth. Yet that same sensitivity means underuse carries heavier costs. According to a 2025 scoping review of digital technology and child development, one of the clearest and most consistent impacts of overuse shows up in the prefrontal cortex. This is the region central to self-control, planning, and reasoning. In adolescence, it is still undergoing refinement. If tasks that should challenge it are outsourced again and again, those circuits may fail to mature to full strength. What an adult might slowly erode after decades of neglect, a child may never properly build at all. Think of it as missed training. An athlete who skips conditioning during formative years may never develop optimal endurance later, no matter how hard they practice as adults. The brain follows a similar trajectory. If an adolescent continually hands over essay writing, problem solving, or even basic recall to a machine, then at the very time that their neural systems are designed to strengthen under stress, they instead adapt to passivity. This isn't speculation. It is the biological reality of how sensitive windows of development interact with experience. Effort wires pathways. Ease leaves them undernourished. The presentation of AI tools compounds this risk. Educational apps and tech platforms market their software as learning enhancers, promising to accelerate mastery by easing difficulty. Instant outlines, automated flashcards, polished grammar, all are framed as smarter ways to study. Yet these shortcuts skip the engagement that turns knowledge into memory. A student who reads pre-generated summaries may appear fluent in class the next day, but their hippocampus, the brain's memory hub, has done little work. When tested later, comprehension crumbles because nothing was consolidated. What masquerades as cognitive enhancement is often a hollow performance. Evidence for this surfaced in classroom trials. In a 2025 study, 2 groups of students wrote essays, one independently, the other with AI assistance. Grading right after completion showed minimal difference between them. But weeks later, the gap opened wide. Students who had written their essays without help scored about 40% higher on retention assessments than their peers who leaned on AI. The unaided group showed clear signs of hippocampal engagement and recall. The AI-assisted group demonstrated only surface-level learning that evaporated quickly. The numbers underscored what concerned parents had already intuited. Polished work does not equal lasting knowledge. For households, this can create an invisible trap. Assignments still get turned in, grades don't plummet, and teachers, sometimes aided by AI grading systems themselves, flag fewer errors. On the surface, everything looks fine. But beneath the scores, neural scaffolding is thin. Prefrontal circuits are less exercised, hippocampal encoding is incomplete, and the anterior cingulate, which monitors error and conflict, gets less training. The child progresses in appearance while lagging in mental endurance. By the time the shortfall becomes visible, the habits are already ingrained. It is important to highlight that this is not a matter of fault on the part of children. They are responding to the environment presented to them. When told that a tool makes assignments easier, of course they will use it, especially when their brains naturally value short-term relief over long-term gain. Developmental psychology reminds us that adolescents lack the biological foresight to weigh distant consequences. They act in line with immediate reward. That instinct is amplified when the culture around them applauds efficiency and simplicity. The outcome is predictable: overuse of shortcuts, not because they are careless, but because their biology and environment push them toward it. Resilience is another casualty. Part of growing up is developing tolerance for frustration and the grit to persist when work feels uncomfortable. These abilities are not abstract. They correspond to circuits in the anterior cingulate cortex. When teenagers face setbacks, this region lights up, helping them monitor errors and regulate emotions, building endurance for future challenges. But when errors are quietly corrected by software and conflicts are erased before they appear, that developmental workout never happens. Adolescents arrive at adulthood with fewer mental calluses. A simple obstacle feels larger, patience runs thinner, and persistence does not come as naturally. Beyond cognition, there are social and identity effects. Writing, in particular, is not only about transferring facts, but about finding a personal voice. The messy process of trial and error, drafting, rephrasing, struggling to capture a thought, is how students define opinions and develop a sense of authorship. When AI produces polished, generic responses, individuality flattens. Teenagers may hand in neat assignments, but the underlying confidence that comes from building and expressing their own ideas weakens. Over time, achievements feel borrowed rather than earned, undermining self-belief. Looking ahead, the stakes extend beyond individual classrooms. If today's adolescents repeatedly bypass the cognitive work of problem-solving, what does that mean for them as adults navigating complexity? They may function well enough for routine tasks, but falter when collaboration and sustained reasoning are required. A 40% memory gap seen in today's homework assignments could, at scale, translate into populations less equipped for long-term challenges. This risk is not destiny, but it is a plausible trajectory if no corrective steps are taken. The key lies in plasticity. Young brains are built to adapt to their environment, whether that environment prioritizes exercise or shortcut. Circuits become what they practice. If they rehearse reasoning, recall, and endurance, those pathways thicken. If they repeatedly defer to automation, those same circuits underdevelop. Unlike adults, they cannot simply decide later to rewire fully, because the window for growth is finite. Plasticity makes you the period of both opportunity and vulnerability. Whatever is reinforced then shapes capacity for decades. Parents are not powerless in this equation. Research suggests that simple interventions can safeguard growth. Child development experts in 2025 recommended keeping AI use limited in early grades for core subjects, encouraging kids to attempt tasks independently before seeking automated support. Direct parent-child teaching, reading together, solving problems step by step, offers cognitive exercise that no shortcut replaces. If AI is used, it should play a feedback role only after the child has produced their own attempt. These adjustments align with evidence on memory retention, error monitoring, and prefrontal strengthening, all of which depend on active engagement. The broader debate about AI in education must move beyond convenience and efficiency. The question is not just whether children finish homework faster, but whether their most formative years are wiring durable capacities or thinning them out. Parents may see convenience, and children may feel ease, but the difference between enduring knowledge and temporary performance is already visible in outcome data. The numbers established so far, about a third of young children already exposed, 40% memory gaps in experimental trials, serve as early indicators of a challenge that could define entire generations if ignored. Gen Z and Gen Alpha face higher stakes not because they are less capable, but because the architecture of their brains is still under construction. What they practice now will become their baseline later. If effort is consistently bypassed, scaffolding may remain underbuilt. While it is too soon to claim inevitability, the weight of current findings makes prevention a safer stance than dismissal. The convenience of today could be the limitation of tomorrow. And while much of this sounds heavy, not every outcome of AI overuse looks grim at first glance. Some effects are strange, even absurd, moments that at once spark laughter and reveal how far dependency can drift from common sense. When AI dependency gets ridiculous, when AI dependence crosses into the absurd, it often reveals truths that are harder to confront through data alone. The everyday consequences can be strange enough to spark amusement, yet behind the humor lies an erosion of skills and confidence. Researchers and media coverage in 2025 highlighted one striking area: the way people have begun forming deep emotional bonds with social AIs. Cases like Travis and his relationship with Lily Rose, an AI companion designed to mimic a supportive partner, were widely discussed. Another example that circulated was Annie, a conversational AI developed in experimental labs that users described as charming and endearing. These interactions may look like harmless entertainment, but survey data shows a growing slice of the population, especially younger users, sees these relationships as more than passing novelties. In the US, a national survey suggested that nearly a fifth of adults had already interacted with AI in a romantic or semi-romantic context. And among younger respondents, some admitted they could imagine long-term companionship with an AI partner. These shifts illustrate not only how quickly dependence spreads, but also how profoundly it reshapes the way people approach intimacy, trust, and communication. Relationships have always been a central way we define ourselves. The slow and sometimes awkward process of learning to connect, risking rejection, and building shared meaning is part of how we grow resilience. But when AI companions step into that role, always available, always affirming, the practice that forms emotional strength goes missing. Psychologists caution that this doesn't just alter how individuals handle romance. It ripples outward into broader patterns of empathy and patience. If experiences of vulnerability and misunderstanding are softened or skipped entirely, the skills built from those experiences can atrophy, much like in used muscles. What should be messy practice in shaping bonds turns into flat simulation, and for some, the simulation feels enough to settle for. The risks here extend beyond private relationships. Studies of social AI use at the Media Lab observed people reporting that, after regular interactions with companion bots, their own natural conversation patterns shifted. Dialogue with humans felt slower, less predictable, sometimes more frustrating. The AI offered steady affirmation, but people did not. Over weeks, some participants began showing reluctance to handle conflict in real relationships, preferring the safety of their AI conversants. This reluctance mirrors what we saw in earlier sections with critical thinking. When the brain learns that effort is avoidable, the instinct to engage weakens. Whether it's an essay or an argument, the same principle applies. Convenience redefines the threshold of difficulty. The trend is not limited to intimacy. It shows up in voice and authorship too. Many workers and students describe feeling detached from their own writing after months of heavy AI assistance. Their drafts look polished, but no longer sound like them. Linguistic analysis of AI-assisted text backs this up. Personal quirks in phrasing and rhythm give way to a standardized, efficient, but bland tone. Writers lose practice in crafting sentences that reflect their history, their emotions, their perspective. The more this cycle spreads, the more communication itself risks becoming homogenized. Instead of voices distinct and varied, we get streams of content shaped by the same predictive engines. This flattening matters not only for expression, but for identity. Writing has long been one of the ways people form a sense of self, especially during school and early adulthood. Rough drafts are clumsy but personal, and refinement through feedback builds both skill and confidence. If an AI intervenes at every step, that process breaks down. Feedback ends up directed at machine-shaped sentences, not at the person's authentic attempt. One solution suggested by educators is deceptively simple. Keep at least one early draft unaided. Just as musicians practice scales before performing, students need to wrestle with raw expression before turning to supportive tools. Without such exercises, even well-intentioned AI assistance risks eroding the very self-trust it was meant to enhance. Dependency on navigation technology provides another case study. Media reports over the last decade, and summarized in recent research, describe how heavy reliance on GPS correlates with weakening of the hippocampus, the brain's memory hub. Expert commentary in the 2025 Scoping Review noted that people who constantly outsource spatial navigation begin showing measurable reductions in spatial memory tasks. The funny anecdotes, people driving in circles or being stranded by faulty directions, mask the deeper issue. Many of us no longer know how to navigate familiar environments unaided. The cognitive map in our heads, once trained by practice, is left underutilized. What seems like harmless reliance becomes a form of learned helplessness, extending the same principle of atrophy observed in critical thinking and writing. Psychologists studying these patterns describe a slow erosion of confidence. It does not come from one dramatic collapse, but from the steady substitution of practice with shortcut. In early stages, the substitution feels empowering. Less time, fewer errors, smoother results. Yet gradually the inner message shifts. I can't do this as well without help. In classrooms, this appears when students ask to write independently, hedge their words, apologize for imperfections, or outright freeze. In workplaces, it shows up when employees describe panic at being asked to present without pre-written prompts. Confidence withers, replaced with doubt that they can manage unaided. What once was a skill becomes a source of anxiety. Humor often softens the seriousness of these trends. Viral stories of AI-drafted resumes, left unchanged, or school papers accidentally submitted with hidden placeholders, get shared for amusement. They show a surface-level carelessness, but underneath they reflect a dependency, so strong that individuals struggle to notice what they hand in. These mistakes are not isolated slip UPS. They are signs of systems built around constant reliance. Each time such stories go viral, part of the reason they resonate is because observers quietly recognize their own vulnerability to the same errors. The discomfort keeps circling back to this theme of powerlessness. Left unchecked, reliance on AI doesn't only change how well we perform tasks, it changes how willing we are to attempt them alone. Spontaneity, creativity, and problem-solving begin to carry an invisible disclaimer. Confirm with the tool first. For human development, this shift carries a cost similar to skipping the gym entirely and letting a machine build your muscles for you. A paradox, since no such machine exists. The muscles stay untrained. In the same way, no shortcut can replace the formative role of struggle in cultivating resilience. Yet it is important to note that AI use does not need to result in uniform decline. The problem emerges when tools shift from support to substitution. In communication, One safeguard is deliberate voice practice, making time to express thoughts unaided before polish. In navigation, experts suggest taking short trips without GPS, reclaiming trust in spatial memory. In relationships, psychologists recommend clear boundaries. Let AI remain a supportive distraction, but seek vulnerability and growth in human connections where friction and misunderstanding are part of the training process. None of these measures call for total rejection of AI. They call for balance that keeps cognitive circuits and emotional networks active, rather than surrendering them wholesale. The absurd moments of AI dependence, whether it's mistaking a chatbot for a soulmate or panicking without GPS, are easy to laugh at, but they pull us toward one conclusion. Every shortcut we normalize leaves less opportunity for the brain to flex its strengths. The brain stores what it rehearses, and it forgets what it doesn't. If misapplied, AI risks rehearsing weakness instead of resilience. What stands out is how universal these experiences have become. People across generations report some version of this fragility, whether in their conversations, their memory of routes, or their comfort with self-expression. The humor of the mistakes makes them shareable, but the underlying unease keeps them memorable. At some level, we recognize that these lapses aren't just accidents. They follow a pattern of small rewards pulling us back into the same cycle, until reliance feels like the new normal. And that turn toward reward signals the next piece of the puzzle. Why these shortcuts feel so good in the moment, yet leave us weaker once the moment passes. The short-term dopamine trap. Think about the rhythm of checking a screen. You swipe, see something new, and feel a brief spark that fades quickly. The cycle repeats, not because the moment was rich, but because it was effortless. Shortcuts from AI trigger the same mechanics, but with a dangerous twist. When you let ChatGPT or similar systems produce an outline, summarize a complex text, or draft a report, the process feels like progress. That sense of productivity cloaks the fact that your brain's chemistry is responding much like it does to entertainment scrolling. The reinforcement is based on ease, not depth, but the illusion of accomplishment makes it feel legitimate. That illusion is powerful because it encourages justification. People know that binging short clips or idly scanning feeds is shallow. Yet when AI makes a task faster and smoother, they tell themselves it is smarter or efficient. The brain's reward system doesn't distinguish between meaningful output and shallow shortcuts. It simply reacts to how quickly effort turns into completion. The shorter the path, the stronger the reward. That is why automation sticks so firmly. It feels both useful and relieving, which combines to form a reinforcement loop stronger than content meant solely for distraction. The engine behind that loop is dopamine. Dopamine is not a chemical of pleasure, so much as a chemical of pursuit. It signals that a behavior is worth repeating, that the next round will feel good as well. When AI smooths over effort, the brain fires dopamine as if a meaningful accomplishment was earned, even when the underlying networks for reasoning and memory were bypassed. That mismatch creates a cheap exchange. The brain collects its chemical reward without having performed the labor that builds lasting capacity. What results is stimulation without nourishment, rehearsed again and again until it becomes routine. The comparison to empty calories is apartment ultra-processed sugar floods the body with a quick surge of sweetness and energy. But the effect is shallow, and a crash follows. AI shortcuts create a similar cycle in cognition. Outsourcing a solution feels like nourishment at first, but leaves no substance behind. Repeat that choice often enough, and the slow effort that once felt natural becomes distasteful. Pushing through difficult steps is no longer baseline. It feels like deprivation compared to the quick rush of delegated work. The reward system shifts and patience weakens. Unlike junk food or social media binges, the signs of this trap are harder to notice. With food, health indicators change over months. With scrolling, people feel time slip away. With AI, the end product looks polished. A report is finished, an essay is delivered, a problem is solved. That surface of competence masks the cost beneath. Users walk away convinced they've got sharper tools, when the actual muscles of reasoning and memory have been bypassed. The mismatch makes the loop subtle enough to settle in unnoticed. Researchers studying motivation describe a phenomenon that explains this quiet decline. When reward spikes come too often without real investment, the baseline level of drive can fall. Simple tasks that once felt engaging start to feel flat. It is like turning volume up to extremes so often that ordinary levels feel muted. Each fast outcome from automation primes the brain to expect that same immediate feedback. When work demands sustained cognitive effort, motivation goes missing. Tasks feel longer, duller, and less rewarding, not because they changed, but because the brain's expectation did. The shift is gradual, but cumulative. Hours of focused attention get harder to sustain. Restless habits creep in sooner. People fidget through what once felt manageable. The brain is not malfunctioning, it is adapting. But this adaptation tilts towards shortcuts, away from endurance. On a wide scale, when millions lean on the same patterns, the culture recalibrates towards shallower modes of work, with little notice until focus itself seems scarce. Early imaging in 2025 hinted at why these changes felt so resistant to willpower. Studies using fMRI found that in heavy AI users, reward circuits such as the striatum showed clear hyperactivation during assisted tasks. The signatures resembled, though did not match perfectly, those observed in behavioral addiction research. Patterns like those catalogued in internet gaming disorder. Researchers emphasized that this does not mean AI use is identical to an addiction diagnosis, but that comparable reinforcement dynamics could be forming. It is early evidence rather than final proof, but enough to show that the brain's response may not distinguish convenience from compulsion as neatly as we assume. This parallel helps explain why attempts to reduce AI reliance feel hard to maintain. The barrier isn't simply laziness or habit. Once the brain has learned to generate a chemical spike from every shortcut, choosing to go without it means facing not just inconvenience, but a drop in rewarded stimulation. That dip pushes people back toward the tool. As with games or social platforms, it is not intention that keeps users returning, it is chemistry. But unlike entertainment, the pattern is harder to challenge publicly because society frames AI as productivity, not indulgence. Human-computer interaction research adds supporting detail. A CHI 2025 report found that knowledge workers who used generative AI frequently described lower motivation for independent work, along with less critical thinking during tasks. These were self-reports, but the pattern aligns with the reinforcement loop visible in brain scans. Tasks felt lighter, but drive deteriorated. In essence, AI amplified surface efficiency while chipping away at deeper engagement. For classrooms, the mechanics are visible. Students allowed frequent AI assistance remained engaged while the tool ran in the background. Yet weeks later, when tools were removed, patience for problem-solving collapsed. The work itself wasn't beyond them. Their motivation had shifted. Frustration set in faster because the brain had grown accustomed to easy wins. This mirrors the gaming comparison. Video games don't harm in small measures. They distort persistence when the loop dominates. With AI, that loop is not seen as optional play, but professional or academic necessity, which makes overuse feel justifiable. The concern here does not lie in claiming inevitability, but in recognizing plasticity. Neural reward pathways adapt to routines. If those routines train the brain to expect quick answers, baseline drive to push through difficulty may downshift. Imaging evidence supports the possibility, and self-reports echo the outcome. That combination points to risk, even though causation still needs long-term study. Recognizing the neurochemical mechanics sharpens the warning. This is not weakness of character, but the predictable outcome of reinforcement cycles. For viewers, the value lies in breaking the loop early. One practical approach researchers suggest is substituting a small, effort-based task whenever the urge to hand control to AI feels strong. It could be writing a short page by hand, solving a problem without prompts, or setting a 20-minute timer to work unaided. The goal is simple: re-expose the brain to the reward of autonomy and endurance. Each moment of resisted substitution keeps effort circuits active and rebalances the feedback system. The risk of the dopamine trap lies in its disguise. The cycle feels reasonable, tasks are completed, outputs are clean, time is saved. But surface completion doesn't reflect inner growth. When reward is detached from effort too consistently, resilience weakens. Baseline motivation falls. People find themselves restless in the face of work they once welcomed. The pattern escalates not because anyone wants fragility, but because their brains have been conditioned to seek ease first. This is why the trap is so quietly effective. It doesn't announce waste or indulgence. It whispers progress while conditioning dependence. Each shortcut leaves behind a brain a little less satisfied with effort, a little more eager for the quick fix. The truth is sharp. Brains reward shortcuts, but they only grow through struggle. That tension sets up the next step in this story. The challenges AI creates are not the full picture. Under certain conditions, the The same tools can in fact sharpen thinking rather than dull it. The distinction lies not in whether we use AI, but in how we choose to engage with it. Can AI make you smarter if used correctly? So far the evidence has pointed toward decline, but the story is not all caution. The same AI systems that can mute brain activity when treated as substitutes can also strengthen it when engaged strategically. The question, then, is not whether AI dulls or sharpens thought, but under what conditions it does one or the other. Studies and classroom pilots in 2025 began to clarify this distinction, showing that when used as a source of friction rather than a provider of ready answers, AI can help keep the brain active, even improving retention and reasoning. One of the clearest pivots comes through the act of questioning. When learners hand off a problem and accept the output, they drift into passivity. But when they flip the interaction, feeding their own draft, solution, or notes into the system, and then asking for weaknesses, overlooked assumptions, or points of vulnerability, engagement shifts. Here, the AI does not shoulder the cognitive work. Instead, it reflects the user's performance and provides angles to challenge or refine. In observational studies, those who pursued this adversarial stance showed greater activation in the prefrontal cortex, in direct contrast to the collapse observed when AI dominated the task. Experts often describe the framing as sparring versus sheltering. A sparring partner does not fight in your place. They prod, test, and force adjustments. The pressure builds skill. A shelter, by contrast, removes obstacles, leaving the learner untested. With AI tools, many people drift unconsciously into the shelter arrangement, bypassing the very conditions brains require for growth. Yet several documented strategies keep the dynamic on the sparring side. Drafting unaided before inviting critique, prompting AI to play devil's advocate, or requesting targeted counterarguments to stress test reasoning. Each method creates conflict that requires the human user to stay present. In small-scale classroom pilots, teachers structured writing tasks around this principle. Students first wrote unaided drafts, then input them into AI with instructions such as criticize my argument or highlight logical gaps. The results were clear even in limited trials. Instead of copying machine-generated work, students debated with the system, edited their drafts based on feedback, and defended their reasoning. When tested later, they recalled more, understood more, and reported greater confidence compared to peers who relied on AI to produce whole essays. Brain imaging from select participants suggested that hippocampal engagement and prefrontal activity both held stronger in this feedback model. While preliminary, these findings countered fears that AI only weakens effort. In structured contexts, it fostered deeper work. Practical prompts matter here. Educators and experts highlighted that specific instructions can keep users in the active role. For example, a student might tell the AI, "Here is my draft. List 3 weaknesses in reasoning and propose questions I should ask myself to fix them." Another option, generate a short quiz with recall questions on these notes to test what I can remember without looking. Both place responsibility on the user to reflect, adapt, or retrieve, not simply read an answer. These approaches resemble proven memory and reasoning strategies, but carried out with a machine providing variable feedback. College students who experimented with such prompts often pushed the interaction even further, asking the system not just for content critiques, but for meta-critiques. Was their argument too dependent on analogy, too linear, too weak in counterpoint? This practice, referred to as metacognition, is relatively rare in solo work. But with a tool that can instantly play multiple roles, critic, adversary, examiner, students reported seeing their own thinking from new angles. In trial groups, this approach correlated with stronger attention and more robust prefrontal activation, pointing to healthier engagement in precisely those regions dulled by direct substitution. Not every use of AI will tip toward growth. Studies made clear that prompting for instant solutions without contribution leads to weaker recall, weaker reasoning, and flatter motivation. But repeated evidence showed that when people stayed cognitively active and let AI serve as a challenger, the outcomes reversed. Memory improved, reasoning deepened, and tolerance for frustration increased. The very circuits most vulnerable to atrophy became better exercised. Small classroom surveys in 2025 echoed this point. Students who used AI in sparring roles scored higher weeks later than those who bypassed original effort altogether. A caveat remains, however. Because large language models can generate confident but inaccurate statements, users carry the responsibility of verification. Researchers stressed that critique or counterarguments generated by AI should always be cross-checked. Benchmarks, such as Mask, designed to test model honesty, repeatedly show that generative systems can fabricate plausible but false claims. Without careful verification, the cognitive benefits of sparring risk being undermined by misinformation. The model can provoke thought, but the human must confirm truth. What this dual pattern demonstrates is agency. The determining factor is not the machine. It is how deliberately people decide to engage with it. In feedback roles, AI becomes a testing ground, prompting adversarial thinking and building stamina. In passive roles, it becomes a substitute, blunting the very functions it could enhance. The technology contains both possibilities in exactly the same form. The path depends on whether users approach the tool as a coach or as a crutch. This insight is particularly useful for shaping how schools, families, and workplaces respond. A blanket ban misses the chance to train resilience with sparring. Unrestricted copying breeds dependency. Structured confrontation is the midpoint, designing tasks so learners remain authors and solvers while AI plays the part of informed resistance. The same conclusion emerged across settings where this was tried. When students fought to defend or revise their own ideas against feedback, their understanding lasted. When they surrendered the stage, recall faded quickly. To avoid overstating, researchers noted that all of these findings emerged from small pilots, not longitudinal proof. The experiments involved dozens of students, not thousands, and the imaging studies remain preprints. More evidence is needed before declaring general rules. Yet the consistency across observations points to a pattern. AI widens the gap between passive and active learning styles. In passive mode, decline. In active mode, reinforcement. One might look at these outcomes as both warning and opportunity. The danger is greater ease creating silent dependency. The opportunity is structured use turning the same tool into a training partner. Unlike other tools that either harm or help, AI cuts both ways depending on user intent. That makes the distinction personal rather than technological. It places responsibility squarely on habits, not algorithms. For anyone hoping to strengthen rather than surrender their mind, the practical rules become clear. Produce first, critique later. Verify outputs. Frame prompts as challenges, not answers. If AI is used to uncover errors, to oppose assumptions, or to test memory, it functions as a sparring partner that keeps the brain switched on. If it is treated as a blank filler, the atrophy described earlier resumes its course. These findings also lead to a broader question. What habits can people adopt outside of prompts and feedback loops to reinforce resilience in thinking? If structured engagement keeps the brain active, what daily practices help sustain that discipline? This points to strategies beyond technology itself. Methods drawn from psychology and self-regulation that hold the potential to rebuild endurance in decision-making and focus, even in a shortcut-driven environment. Psychological strategies to reclaim brain power. When psychologists discuss ways to counter mental shortcuts, they frame it in terms of habit design. Just as nutrition research supports structured diets to balance intake, cognitive research points to specific boundaries and routines that preserve brain resilience. The phrase AI diet is shorthand many experts now use. Not abstinence, but intentional restriction. Like sugar or caffeine, the question is not whether to consume, but when, how much, and for what purpose. The goal is to keep cognitive training alive, rather than let convenience erode it. The first strategy draws on one of the most well-supported findings in learning science: active recall. Instead of diving straight to AI for assistance, learners should spend a short period, say 20 minutes, retrieving information or solving problems independently. Research on the spacing effect and retrieval practice shows that unaided recall strengthens the hippocampus and supports durable memory formation. In practical form, this might mean attempting to outline an argument or solve a proof before bringing in an AI critique. The act of effortful retrieval, even brief, provides the neural rehearsal that memory requires. Educators and media lab commentators alike describe this as one of the simplest, most effective protections. A second approach emphasizes alternating AI-assisted steps with brain-only work. This mirrors cross-training. Different muscles are stressed on different days. If AI is used to summarize, the analysis should be done independently. If AI generates counterarguments, the synthesis of an essay must come from the user. G 2025 Guidance and the MIT Media Lab team both recommended this alternation explicitly. It ensures that segments of the cognitive chain stay active rather than disappearing wholesale. Importantly, the alternation need not be rigid. The point is to safeguard at least one central step from substitution. Reports from small classroom experiments found that students who divided tasks this way retained more information weeks later than peers who let AI dominate every stage. Third, researchers recommend deliberate no AI windows. This practice resembles digital fasting, setting aside protected intervals where technology cannot supply answers. Studies on decision fatigue and behavioral self-regulation show that scheduled friction resets the brain's tolerance for effort. Even 30 minutes per day, devoted to writing, brainstorming, or problem-solving without external help, conditions the prefrontal cortex and anterior cingulate to remain engaged. The first sessions often feel uncomfortable. The blank page seems heavier, but with repetition, frustration diminishes and resilience grows. Teachers experimenting with this approach reported that students' patience for complex reasoning improved measurably once such windows became routine. A fourth strategy involves deliberate manual practice, such as solving math problems with pen and paper or drafting paragraphs unaided. Neuroscience emphasizes that kinesthetic writing and hand-based calculations stimulate memory, encoding in ways keyboard entry does not. Even 5 to 10 repetitions per day help maintain circuits that otherwise fall quiet. Researchers equate this with gym training. The move may feel inefficient, but efficiency is not the target. The target is strength conditioning for neural pathways. And like microsets in exercise, the benefits accumulate across weeks. Underlying these practices is a point of caution. Evidence so far comes from small pilots, anecdotal professional reports, and limited preprints. Designers and writers who restricted AI use during early creative phases often reported that fluency and originality gradually returned. A few even described renewed enjoyment in work once struggling became part of their process again. But these outcomes are not locked in by large longitudinal trials. They stand as early signals, not guarantees. The lesson is to treat the patterns as opportunity, not certainty. For many, success rests on accountability rather than willpower. Psychologists studying habit design suggest tracking even one metric can change behavior. An effective exercise is to keep a brief daily journal with questions like, "Did I try unaided work before consulting AI today?" Or, "How many tasks began with effort before automation?" This self-check functions less as proof of progress and more as reinforcement of intention. Behaviorally, the act of recording raises awareness and anchors the new routine. It shifts the decision from abstract intention into visible habit. When these strategies are applied, they do not create restrictions for their own sake. They re-establish the pressure that allows brain regions, the hippocampus for memory, the prefrontal cortex for planning, and the anterior cingulate for persistence, to remain trained. Without such boundaries, AI flattens the effort-reward curve until thinking feels optional. With them, people experience both convenience and challenge, which together produce efficiency without erosion. Professionals in creative fields who embrace these rules often noticed more than restored skill. They noticed restored confidence. A novelist who drafted without AI before inviting critique reported that her voice felt sharper. An architect who forbade AI assistance in early sketches regained the spark of original design. A lawyer who hand-outlined briefs prior to AI checks said his clarity of reasoning improved markedly. These accounts remain anecdotal, yet they illustrate the same pattern. The discipline of withholding convenience reactivates ingenuity. Limitations made space for depth to return. Families and classrooms can extend these principles at scale. Some parents designate dinner conversations as AI-free explorations, requiring children to explain ideas without quick searches. Classrooms can alternate digital and non-digital days, protecting memory rehearsal across the week. Workplaces can establish group brainstorms without automation before using AI to polish results. The framing is not punitive. It is comparable to exercise regimens, uncomfortable at first, stabilizing with practice, and protective over the long term. What unites these methods is balance. They do not demand rejection of AI, nor do they permit unrestrained dependence. They carve controlled friction back into a world weighted towards simplicity. Whether through active recall, alternating tasks, fasting windows, or manual reps, the intent is to keep effort visible in daily life. Once effort disappears, so does resilience. Once resilience disappears, The brain is left vulnerable to shortcuts that feel productive while emptying its capacity. The challenge, then, is not in knowing these tactics, but in maintaining them. Habits fade easily when convenience presents itself. That is why researchers argue for deliberate structures. Pre-committed sessions, preset timers, written tallies. Resistance works best when it is externalized, not when dependent solely on momentary willpower. Each structure offsets the evolutionary urge to conserve energy and helps sustain the harder path. This framing leads to a final reflection. For all the personal strategies and classroom designs, the deeper vulnerability does not lie in the tools themselves, but in the wiring of the brain. These methods function not as tricks, but as reminders that struggle must be preserved against an instinct that values ease above all. Understanding why that instinct dominates requires widening the lens beyond psychology into human evolution itself. The evolutionary bug in the system. If you look at all the research together, the larger theme is clear. The human brain is not malfunctioning. It is following the same logic that kept our ancestors alive for millennia. Conserve energy whenever possible. In environments of scarcity, where food sources were uncertain and danger was constant, this energy-saving instinct was vital. Thinking is metabolically expensive, and if an easier path led to survival, our wiring naturally favored it. That tendency remains embedded in us today. The complication is that the environment has shifted. The old instinct no longer aligns with modern conditions, where abundance and automation dominate. This is where the concept of evolutionary mismatch becomes useful for understanding. Our brains are applying ancient rules to a landscape they were never designed for. A simple analogy illustrates the point. To gather food generations ago, people had no choice but to walk and endure strain. That physical struggle was unavoidable and built endurance at the same time. The same held true for thinking. With no shortcuts available, memory and reasoning had to be exercised. Solving a problem was both work and training. Today we outsource these demands. Cars replace walking, calculators replace arithmetic, and AI replaces the act of struggling through reasoning. The instinct to conserve effort still fires, but instead of preserving life, it often undermines long-term growth. This tension between instinct and environment is not about failure, but about adaptation lagging behind rapid change. It helps to think on evolutionary timelines. Biological wiring updates slowly over tens of thousands of years. Technology reshapes behavior in under a decade. The gap between the pace of one and the acceleration of the other creates mismatched incentives. The same preference for shortcuts that once secured survival now drives us toward options that weaken critical skills. Researchers describe this as a form of cognitive offloading. When information or processes are repeatedly externalized, the brain reduces its internal rehearsal of them. Studies of the so-called Google effect show this clearly. When people expect that answers are stored externally, their recall for content declines, even as their recall of where to find it improves. The mechanism is the same with AI. Offload now, remember the path, forget the content. The instinct is efficient, but misapplied in a context that rewards surface productivity without building depth. This mismatch explains many common struggles. Procrastination, for example, is often criticized as poor discipline, but framed biologically, it fits the pattern. The brain steers toward actions with smaller energy cost and faster payoff. In the past, procrastination meant sweeping or talking to a neighbor instead of starting a more complex chore. Now, it often means diverting attention to digital tools that immediately reduce cognitive strain, letting search engines, apps, or AI provide shortcuts. The instinct is constant, but the environment amplifies its reach, expanding avoidance into an everyday habit supported by endless technological crutches. The implications extend beyond productivity into identity. There was once no alternative to using intelligence for survival. If you did not recall routes, you were lost. If you failed to analyze weather, harvests failed. If you could not piece together observations, you left yourself vulnerable. Survival forced mental practice. Now, intelligence feels optional. Maps, prompts, and generated responses perform the labor that once demanded engagement. The deep question is not whether humans are capable, but whether we will voluntarily use those capacities when our surrounding environment stops insisting on them. This leads to a broader cultural tension around how progress is defined. Each innovation promises one more release from strain, one more cycle of automation. Convenience becomes equated with advancement. Yet when every difficult step is removed, the very work that forges endurance disappears too. Experts warn that the danger lies not in any single tool, but in normalization. When cultures praise efficiency above all, the choice to bypass struggle looks like smart adaptation rather than lost opportunity. The evolutionary bias toward conserving energy combines with social reinforcement to make disengagement appear wise. The bug in the system is not malicious. It hides under the surface of comfort. Part of why this mismatch can be so costly is that it often remains invisible. Hunger or collapse were obvious signals for earlier generations. In contrast, polished outputs produced with AI look entirely successful. A paper is submitted, a project is finished, a presentation is delivered. Teachers may reward the product, employers may praise the efficiency. Underneath, however, the brain has skipped the circuits of attention, recall, and error detection. Because the act of conserving energy feels good in the moment, the long-term impact escapes notice until gaps emerge later in memory or performance. What looks like productivity in the short term can mask underuse accumulating quietly. The invisibility is compounded further by external praise. Society consistently rewards people who reduce effort by adopting the latest tools. A neat essay written quickly, or a solution derived instantly, is celebrated. The fact that less mental engagement occurred is rarely measured. People are encouraged to think of efficiency as intelligence itself. This messaging aligns with biology so smoothly that pushing against it feels counterintuitive. Yet the very circuits that once safeguarded us require active friction to grow. Without deliberate exercise, they adapt downwards. The adaptation is natural, but not irreversible if recognized. Importantly, this mismatch applies across age groups and professions. Children miss chances to build strong neural scaffolding if reliance on AI starts early. Adults allow once robust circuits to lose fluency through underuse. The wiring is universal, which means the vulnerability is universal. In workplace cultures that idolize speed and efficiency, even experienced professionals fall into the same pattern. This is not about individual weakness. It is about shared biology echoing through an environment designed around convenience. When physiology and culture pull in the same direction, resistance requires intention. The broader consequence is existential. If as a species we consistently let the energy-saving instinct dictate choices, then the higher forms of intelligence, creativity, concentrated memory, sustained reasoning, may become less practiced. They will not disappear overnight, but they can flatten into reactive rather than generative modes. Under unexpected stress, societies that have skipped practice in deeper thought will find their resilience limited. Humanity's greatest capacities are not erased, but possibly sidelined. What once created civilization may erode quietly through disuse. Experts now argue that managing this mismatch may prove to be the era's central cognitive challenge. The tools we build showcase extraordinary human capability, yet they also amplify the same bias that discourages effort. That is why neuroscientists and psychologists point to deliberate strategies, not bans or abdication. Context has changed too rapidly for instincts alone to protect society's intelligence. If brains adapt to the environment, then we must shape environments that keep circuits engaged. Without structured habits, the tendency toward passivity perpetuates. With those habits, the mismatch can be repurposed into opportunity instead of liability. This reframing matters. It shifts interpretation away from blame and towards responsibility. People are not giving up intelligence. Their brains are responding predictably to incentives. The challenge is finding ways to redirect those incentives so that conservation no longer means decline. This is why the mismatch framework, though unsettling, offers clarity. Once you see the bug not as a fatal flaw, but as a predictable adaptation, it becomes possible to counter it with deliberate, structured practices. The problem is not personal weakness. It is an environment misaligned with our wiring, and environments can be reshaped. Understanding the presence of this mismatch is the starting point. What follows is the need for action. Awareness alone does not rebuild resilience. To protect intelligence, people must adopt concrete strategies that make engagement the easier option. The tools are available, the research offers guidance, but the effort has to be claimed. The question that matters now is not whether the bug exists. It does, but whether we will choose steps strong enough to override it. How to begin those steps is the focus of what comes next. Action plan for viewers. If the evidence shows one consistent lesson, it is that passivity carries a cost. The scans, surveys, and classroom trials all point to the same pattern. When we default to convenience, capability erodes. But the other lesson is just as important. decline is not inevitable. Habits reshape the brain. The actions you take today are what you will rely on tomorrow. So the challenge is to translate the research into a plan you can actually apply, something simple enough to remember, but strong enough to protect core functions. Rather than a long list of scattered tips, think of this as a concise protocol. 3 rules that capture the essence of what neuroscientists and educators now recommend. Each one is grounded in evidence and designed to anchor habits that keep the prefrontal cortex, hippocampus, and attention systems active. They are not abstract ideals. They are direct, actionable steps you can start within the next 24 hours. The first is the draft first rule. Before asking AI for help, commit 10 to 20 minutes to drafting something unaided. An outline, a few written paragraphs, a set of problem-solving steps. Only after that do you enter your draft into a system for critique or refinement. Learning research shows that active retrieval and generation encode knowledge in the hippocampus far more effectively than passively consuming information. Classroom studies, including those highlighted by the Media Lab in 2025, demonstrate much stronger retention when this principle is followed. The challenge for you is straightforward. In the next day, pick one task. Whether it's writing an email, solving a homework problem, or sketching ideas for a project, and complete the first pass entirely on your own before consulting AI. Then compare what changes when you use the tool afterward. The second is the weekly digital fast. Set aside one block of time, half a day each week, where you solve problems, write, or create without any AI assistance at all. This isn't about banning technology across your entire life. It is about giving your attention and working memory systems a protected environment to practice without shortcuts. Studies on effort and decision fatigue show that deliberate no-tech windows recalibrate focus and resilience. Reports from classrooms and professionals who try these fasts consistently describe 2 stages. Initial discomfort, then a surprising return of creativity and sharper focus. For your immediate challenge, mark off a single 3-hour window this week where you work manually. Write notes, read on paper, brainstorm ideas. Notice how your patience bends, then steadies. The third is test with AI. Instead of asking for answers, use AI to quiz you. After reviewing a concept or drafting your own material, give the system your notes and instruct it to generate questions that test your understanding. This aligns with decades of research on the spacing effect and retrieval practice, which show that testing strengthens memory far more than rereading or reviewing solutions. In pilot groups, students who used AI to generate short quizzes, then attempted them without looking at their notes, demonstrated significantly higher recall weeks later. The immediate challenge for you, after reading something today, an article, a chapter, or your own notes, ask an AI to generate 5 questions about it and try to answer them cold. You will feel the difference in effort, and that stress is the signal memory needs. What ties these rules together is the deliberate creation of friction. Draft first forces generation before refinement. Digital fast enforces protected strain. Test with AI pushes retrieval rather than consumption. Each interrupts the brain's natural instinct to offload the moment work becomes uncomfortable. Over time, they form a habit architecture that keeps thinking active and memory strong, while still allowing technology to accelerate growth when used properly. Think of them as safeguards against passive decline. The temptation to ignore these strategies is understandable. Passive use feels smooth and rewarding, and polished outputs offer the illusion of progress. But repeated shortcuts carry costs much harder to reverse later. Like poor nutrition habits that compound over years, over-reliance on automation builds compounding deficits in focus, memory, and stamina. Applied regularly, these 3 rules act as a counterbalance. They are practical protections against letting convenience hollow out the very circuits intelligence depends on. It also matters how you reinforce these practices. The brain responds not only to effort, but to meaning attached to effort. If you frame working without help as a burden, motivation fades quickly. If you treat it as proof of capability, as a reminder that ideas and solutions can originate in your own mind, motivation grows. Psychologists emphasize that self-reward builds alternative reinforcement patterns, countering the dopamine spikes tied to easy shortcuts. After completing your draft first exercise, pause and recognize the autonomy of what you produced. After a digital fast, share with someone what you accomplished unaided. Linking effort to pride helps train your motivation circuits to seek out the harder path voluntarily. Accountability reinforces this process even further. Isolation makes it easy to slip. But when students take on no AI challenges in groups, or teams agree to start projects manually before automation kicks in, the culture itself shifts. Teachers who tried group-based no AI days reported that students quickly began comparing results not just for correctness, but for the originality of their unaided work. Professionals who integrated draft-first rules into collaborative environments noticed higher creativity in brainstorms. When peers acknowledge the value of effort, the social reward system doubles the effect of personal discipline. For now, this is where you can experiment. Share your 24-hour challenge in the comments and see how others compare their own experiences. The act of public accountability strengthens the personal commitment. The point is not to declare war on AI. The point is to preserve human capacity while engaging with the tools intelligently. Boundaries are not restrictions for their own sake. They are training structures that allow balance. The more often you practice unaided thinking, the sharper your circuits stay. The more often you let automation replace every step, the faster they atrophy. Each choice compounds either toward resilience or fragility. What remains is the decision to discipline yourself. The data already shows the risks, and the strategies now exist to counter them. The draft-first rule, weekly digital fast, and test with AI protocol do not require massive overhaul. They require only minutes and a recurring commitment. They are minimal constraints with disproportionate benefits. Your brain is plastic. It will reshape itself according to what you rehearse. The question is whether what you do rehearses intelligence or rehearses avoidance. So here is your immediate challenge. Choose one of the 3 rules today. Apply it to one specific task in the next 24 hours. If you take the draft-first rule, write one email or page unaided before asking any tool to adjust it. If you take the digital fast, block a set of hours tomorrow without AI and complete a project manually. If you take test with AI, generate quiz questions from your notes and see what you've truly retained. Then reflect on what shifted compared to the passive alternative and share that observation. That act, the attempt and the reflection, is your first proof that change is possible. The strength or weakness of your intelligence will not be decided by AI itself. It will be decided by how you structure your relationship with it. These 3 rules offer a start, but protecting your brain requires seeing clearly what each shortcut signals. Every time you bypass effort, you train yourself to surrender responsibility. Every time you accept effort, you train yourself to stay in command. And that choice carries forward, shaping more than just what you finish today. It shapes the architecture of your mind itself. AI can reshape patterns of use in your brain. Early evidence shows measurable changes in memory, attention, and reasoning when reliance becomes passive. What feels like smoother productivity in the moment may quietly train key circuits to disengage. The risks are not certain decline, but a pattern of vulnerability, one that grows if left unexamined. The encouraging side is that research also points to simple, protective habits. Active recall, unaided drafts, and deliberate no AI windows help preserve cognitive strength. Start small. Try one 20-minute thinking session today without assistance. Then comment below with how it felt.